Hello and welcome to another St. Joseph School Lightboard video. Today we are going to be looking at addition and subtraction of fractions, and the concept of what we're going to be learning today is why we need to change denominators to make them equal. In my class we have a mantra that says fairness is not sameness, but when we're dealing with fractions, in order to be fair, things kind of have to be the same. So let's take a look at this fractions addition question that we have right here. We've got 1/2 and we're going to be adding 1/4 to it. Now if we visualize what that would look like, we're going to draw out 1/2. Okay, so there's a half, and what we're going to be doing is using a same size whole, well, roughly a same size whole. I know I'm not exactly 100% equal. We're going to be adding 1/4 to it. Now why do we care about this? Well, let's think about if you were getting half of one of these wholes, you would be getting technically more than this. We can see that because the pieces that we have here, the quarters, they're smaller than the half. And so if you handed a quarter of whatever it was that you were giving out to somebody and they saw that you had a half, they might think to themselves, well, wait a second, that's not really all that fair. So how do we make it fair? Well, what we need to do when we're dealing with fractions, particularly addition and subtraction of fractions, is that we need to be dealing in same size pieces in order to make things fair. And that's kind of the concept of what we need to do when we're thinking about addition and subtraction of fractions. We want to work with things that are similar. So how do we go about doing that? Well, if you take a look at this denominator, it's 2 and if we have 4 over here. Well, I know that if I take and multiply 2 by 2, and multiply the top by 2, and essentially what I'm doing here is when I'm multiplying a fraction, which really is a decimal, when I'm multiplying a decimal by a whole number, like 2, I'm actually making things smaller, and you can see that by me doing this. If I split this into 2, what I've done here is I've split that and that. And now you'll notice that what I've got here is I've got something that's got 4 pieces inside. I didn't really necessarily change what I originally started with. I did have a half, and the half is still that blue that's kind of in there right now. But with me dividing it again or multiplying it by 2, that fraction, I'm able to make it into a similar shape such as this. And now that I have this, what I essentially can do is I can look at taking and just doing the addition. And the addition for this, so if I rewrite this fraction, I've got 2/4 plus 1/4. So I've got my 2/4 here. Here's 1. Here's 2, and then here's my other quarter there. If I have those and I put them together, what I have are 3/4. And now why would it be quarters and not eighths? Well, that's actually a really good question. When you think about this, the size of the whole matters. And in this case, the size of the whole, when we're looking at what this whole actually is, it's only 4 pieces. So if you think about that for a second, when we actually have a quarter, I know I drew this out to make it look like I had 1 out of 4, which is what that fraction says. But technically, if I only have 1 out of 4, I only have this little piece. So I could erase that and then kind of move it over. So if I took that and I moved it over to there, now I've just added 1/4 to what my original one was. So if I move it, that technically disappears, and I end up with 3/4. So hopefully that helps with the concept of addition. Now the nice thing about addition and subtraction of fractions is that addition and subtraction, they're the same thing. They follow the same rules where you're trying to find a common denominator or common size pieces before you can actually do anything. So now if we put this into step by step, here's what you would do. Step number 1 is you look for common denominators. Do you have them? In this case, I did not. So I had to make a common denominator, and what I did to one, I had to do to the top of it as well. So I multiplied the bottom by 2, multiplied the top by 2, and that changed my fraction to an equivalent fraction of 2/4, or which is 1/2. 2/4, and I added the 1/4 to it. I added the top numbers but left the bottom numbers the same. Now if you can remember that, that's essentially all that addition and subtraction of fractions are. And let's do a subtraction one over here. So let's say I've got 3/4 and I'm going to be subtracting a half. All right, so we're going to use the same kind of numbers, but we're going to make this look a little different. Now what I've got here, if I were to draw it out, I would have 3/4 like that. So there's 1, there's 2, there's 3. And I'm taking away a half. But if I take away a half, what does a half look like? Well, a half if these were exactly the same size, which they're not, then it would look something like that. So I'm going to be subtracting something that size away from this. So that size away from that. Okay, so it's not putting those two together or showing this. I'm just visually representing that's the kind of chunk that I'm going to be taking out of that hole right there. Now, if I did the math, like we talked about earlier, I want to change this fraction into an equivalent fraction. So I'm going to multiply it by 2 and then multiply it by 2 up here. And that will change my fraction to equivalent. So I would have 3/4, which is this guy right here. And I'm going to be subtracting the equivalent of a half, which in this case, 2 times 1 is 2. So if I split that again, 2 times 1 is 2, and 2 times 2 is 4, so I would be subtracting that. So I'm subtracting 2/4 from this. And if you notice, 2/4, if I took away 2/4, it'd be this size. I'd just be doing kind of that. That's what subtraction is. I'm taking it away, and I know that my finger is probably not the best eraser. So I'd be doing that, and it's going to leave me with what I had, which is 1/4. So 3 minus 2 is 1. And make sure that's in there. So 2 is 1, and then the quarters are going to stay the same. It was still the quarter size, so I'm going to make that into a quarter. If you have any questions or something doesn't quite make sense to you, by all means, pause, rewatch the video, and listen for some type of explanation. But essentially what you're looking for, just try to change the denominators so that they're equivalent, so add or subtract the top numbers, leave the denominators the same. Thanks for watching.